A difficult raid with cavalrymen and tense battles in the Carpathians together with units of the 38th Army, as a result of which the battalion suffered heavy losses, were left behind. About a month we spent near the cosy Polish town of Mielec. Here we received replenishment and had a good rest. The new year of 1945 was approaching. By dawn on December 31st, the convoy of the 207th OMIB crossed the undulating deck of the high-water wooden bridge over the Vistula near Sandomir. Ice floes and ice lard floated on the greenish-black water. Nearby was a low-water bridge built during the river forcing. The width of the Vistula at the bridge reached 220 to 250 metres. And among the broken ice up and downstream there were groups of pontoons. They were kept in readiness in case the enemy aircraft managed to damage the bridge. And this precaution was not unnecessary. As soon as the last vehicle of the battalion entered the left bank of the Vistula, the Junkers raided the bridge crossing and the city. Even from afar we saw the ancient, known since the X-century, Sandomir. Clouds of smoke hung over the city, but against their background the arrow of St. Jacob's Church, pointing upwards, was quite clearly visible. The frost was biting the faces wickedly. There was not much snow, but in the lowlands and ravines the cars could hardly push through the snow. All residential and non-residential buildings in settlements near Sandomir were occupied by troops. We had to drive the amphibian all day in search of accommodation. Unnoticeably it got dark. Combat more and more often looked at his watch. With these searches and the new year can miss the new year. Have the scouts arrived? Everything is packed to the brim. And it's good that packed, strongly yelling, said Major P.M. Kochnev, recently appointed deputy commander of the battalion on political part. Strength, then. Shortly before midnight we managed to squeeze some of the personnel into the house and barns, already densely occupied before us artillerymen. Here in a small Polish village near Klimentow we celebrated the last front New Year's Eve. On the first day of 1945 the company of Captain NNNE, Emianov had to build up minefields west of Klimentow. They installed round metal anti-tank mines TM-41, which in 1944 our industry began to produce again. All is good, but because of the corrugations is high. Emilanov shared his first impressions, and the miners are happy again their mines are made of metal. Immediately recalled the reaction of our soldiers to the wooden German Holzminnen, which had to deal with a year and a half ago a Kursk bulge. But the appearance of their own metal mines further strengthened their confidence in our growing power. When I now think of the Sandomir bridgehead, I first of all remember two things: the unprecedentedly high density of troops and the iron discipline of camouflage. Everyone, from the soldier to the general, followed the camouflage. Fir trees were tied to tanks and vehicles for camouflage purposes, which covered their tracks in the snow. All units had camouflage winter nets, in which tree branches were woven. Tanks, vehicles, artillery were placed in the woods, bushes or placed close to the houses. And yet it was difficult to hide the concentration of the strike group completely. And the enemy realized that sooner or later the Sandomir bridgehead would be used for an offensive to the west. Even before our arrival there were fierce battles. With the liberation of Sandomir, the bridgehead behind the Vistula was expanded to 75 kilometers along the front and to 50 kilometers in depth. But Hitlerites did not give up hope to eliminate the Sandomir bridgehead, and therefore day by day increased their artillery and bombing strikes. On the night of January 12th, our battalion came to the front line of defence and settled in the forest near Szydlu. The forest was full of troops and resembled a huge anthill. Everyone was eagerly awaiting the beginning of the offensive. The Vistula Oder operation, one of the largest in the Great Patriotic War, was beginning. The 3rd Guards Tank Army, to which our battalion was subordinated, was entering the breakthrough in the strip of the 52nd Army. After a powerful artillery preparation at noon on January 12th, 1945 sappers of the Rifle Division passed through the mine's assault battalions and tanks of the advanced detachment. Behind them moved companies of our battalion. Watch out for mines, these two words were written on signs placed along the narrow passages and were constantly mentioned in the orders of commanders of all ranks. And indeed, the density of the enemy's mining of its front line of defence around the Sandomir bridgehead was so great that at first it even forced the troops to reduce the planned pace of the offensive. Look out for mines passed along the column of soldiers of rifle units and assault battalions. The same words were shouted by drivers of vehicles with infantry. Mines in those days became the #1 danger, but to the fight with them in advance and carefully prepared all kinds of troops and most of all, of course, sappers. Look out for mines we heard incessantly around us. Mines were under our feet, and all engineering units were busy with them. Regimental, divisional, army and front sapper units were consistently widening and re-punching additional passages in the enemy's mine explosive barriers. Elongated charges reinforced on skis were pushed into the minefields. The charges were then detonated, and sappers rushed into the passages formed after the explosions to find and destroy the surviving mines. The enormous efforts of many hundreds of specialists were not wasted. The main zone of German mining was soon overcome. On January 13th, we were delayed in front of Komelnik. Through the deeply echeloned stripes of the German mine barriers were made narrow passages 4 to 6 meters wide. Only in some places they reached 10 meters. If you move a little out of the passage, you will fall on mines, and every hit car or tank immediately created a traffic jam, because it was impossible to bypass them. Nowhere before we had never encountered such skillfully used by the enemy mine barriers. They blocked the passages in the mine barriers and were echeloned in depth every 15 to 20 meters. In addition, the mine barriers were secretly pulled up from the dugouts with the help of blocks and rope. At the dugout, not far from one of the barriers, suddenly appeared a figure in a grey overcoat with lowered lapels of the cap and a white handkerchief in his hand. Ich bin pioneer. Ich bin communist. Ich'll help you, eh? Dubrovsky and I looked at each other. A German sapper, a stocky man, not a young man, drew the approximate boundaries of the minefield in the snow, made a sign for us to move away and warned. Vorsicht, Minen. Watch out for mines. Then, bending down, began to shovel the snow. Soon we really saw the tendrils of an anti-personnel jumping mine. Stop, sapper. Don't demine. Dangerous, poisonous route. We'll blow it up, shouted Captain Dubrovsky. Deutsche Pioneer did not immediately understand us, but then his broad face lit up with a smile. He found several more anti-personnel mines, which were immediately detonated with Tolka sticks. Having widened passages in minefields up to 20 to 25 meters, we, together with the German volunteer assistant, had lunch at the company kitchen. Dangerous work quickly brings people together. Having unbuttoned his overcoat, our new acquaintance groped his tunic for a long time and finally found what he was looking for. He proudly handed us the frayed document. Ich bin communist. The soldiers came up to him and shook his hand. Not every German is an enemy. And then we drove our voluntary assistant on one of the company cars to Komelnik. We explained that he would probably be sent to the rear, and that his document would definitely be useful there. It was suggested to me that it would be good to provide the German with a certificate. After all, he voluntarily helped us, and besides, he demined some of the mines with his own hands. I remember such a paper was written. We said goodbye in a friendly manner. The column of prisoners of war soon disappeared behind a house on the outskirts of Komelnik, and our way lay in the opposite direction. The battalion acted with the advanced detachment of the 6th Guards Tank Corps, providing mine clearance and river forcing. On January 14th, they reached the Nida River. The bridge at Moscovice turned out to be blown up. Some tanks somehow jumped over the shields laid on the ice, but the rest could not pass. Miners of Dubrovsky's company moved over the broken ice to Moscovice, but there behind the destroyed bridge they found anti-transportation mines RME and were engaged in their neutralization. Meanwhile, Emyanov's company began to assemble a set of wheeled gauge bridge. We heard the impact of ice floes on the frame supports and smooth splashes of water from the movement of sappers in rubber overalls on the water. Suddenly bullets whistled over our heads. German speech reached us. Grey overcoats flashed behind the bushes in the northern part of the village. The tankers turned their turrets and struck at the counter-attacking hit lights. Oh shit! It's a trifling river. And how much time we lost, complained the combatant when we examined the assembled bridge. From that moment, and it was decided to organize the provision of the forward detachment on the principle of roles. One company in command with the battalion staff car went with the forward detachment. Another company was preparing the crossing or finishing the demining of passages. And the third, having handed over the work at the previous line to the corps units, was catching up with the advanced detachment. As in a kaleidoscope flashed combat skirmishes, mines, crossings, settlements, meetings with a variety of people. The pace of the offensive was rapidly increasing. We barely had time to fulfill our tasks, keeping up with the advanced detachment. Nida was far behind us. We passed a tributary and then forced Pilica itself. Then came the rivers Varta, Prosna. Jejejo, Radomsko, Dizialusin, Wieland flashed by and remained in the rear. Ie. Onoprienko came running to the crossing near Varuso. Comrade Captain. The battalion was named Czystokowski. That's great. Are you sure you've decoded it? The senior sergeant gave me the text of the radiogram. Decoded exactly. It sounds good. Separate motorized engineer Czastachowski, the order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky and Red Star Battalion, rejoiced our new deputy commander. It would be necessary to gather a flying meeting to announce this event, to congratulate the personnel. Combat took to the congratulations on the radio with interest. Chief of Staff, tell me at least, what is the city of Częstochowa? I don't know much myself. We, with the tankers, operated on the flank, 40 kilometers to the north. The town stands on the Water River. It's a road junction. They say there's a miracle working icon of the Mother Boska of Częstochowska. It's famous all over Poland. That's a good one. Bus! It's a great honor for the battalion. And you, Fyodor Vasilievich, as a commander too, explained Major Kotnev. Keep in mind that not only those who directly stormed the city are honored. Do not forget, and the units that provided its liberation on the flanks or from the air. Good, Pavel Martimianovich, joyfully said the commander. We will henceforth Częstochowsiami. Prepare, Commissar rally. For 7 days of fights we passed together with tankers of PS Rybalko about 300 kilometers on southern Poland. Ahead lay Germany, more precisely old Polish lands, captured by Germans. Winter days were getting warmer and warmer. Now we were warmed not only by the sun, which appeared more and more often from behind the clouds, but also by joyful reports that the 1st Belarusian and our 1st Ukrainian fronts had penetrated deep into the west. We were entering Silesia. Everyone was visibly worried. The command of the 6th Guards Tank Corps was pulling up units, creating a shock fist. We were ordered to give people a rest. On the night of January 19th, the command of all parts of the corps was assembled. Our battalion was represented by Mysiakov, Kochnev and me. The moon brightly illuminated a small clearing surrounded by a dense thicket of trees. There was some kind of solemn silence around. At last a few men came out of the forest. To the gathered, excitedly addressed a tall colonel, it seems, the head of the political department of the corps. We are experiencing historic moments, he said softly. Let us remember them forever. Under the leadership of our party and the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, we reached the borders of Hitler's Germany. Among the troops of the front, we are the first to have the honor to set foot on this land. The enemy is cunning and insidious. Remember this and be on the alert, forward, comrades, to complete victory. The colonel fell silent. All of us were greatly excited. For 4 long years, every frontline soldier dreamed of this moment. We passed the old border of Nazi Germany at night along a forest road. The late winter dawn did not allow us to have a good look at the small town of Karlsruhe, which was marked on our topographic maps, and was a double of the famous town with the same name, located near the Rhine. In a few hours, the battalion was already rushing after the tanks. In the meantime, the German fascist command ordered the withdrawal of its semi-enveloped Silesian group, located southwest of Częstochowa, to prevent the enemy from realizing this intention and to speed up the liberation of the Upper Silesian industrial area. The 3rd Guards Tank Army was turned to the south, along the right bank of the Oder. The 6th Guards Tank Corps was ordered to cut the enemy's communications and from his rear to assist our troops advancing westward. A rapid rush of tanks to the southeast began. The tankers seemed to compete with each other. They burst into settlements so unexpectedly that the German anti-aircraft gunners, who were the main garrison there, from afar took our columns for their tank units. Villages, where the enemy put up strong resistance, tanks bypassed it was forbidden to get involved in street battles. Quickness and maneuver decided the success. In this situation it was very important not to lag behind the tanks. To break away from their own in the rear of the enemy was very dangerous for the battalion. First of all, such a situation threatened the failure to fulfill the combat task. In addition, in such a case it could be necessary to fight independently with the German fascist units. That is why we were so alarmed when on the approaches to the Malapan River we received a radiogram from Emyanov's company about the stopping of one of the vehicles where our miners were. The excitement ended only after we waited for Emyanov's company in the square indicated to it and made sure that it arrived at the meeting point in full strength. And here, not for the first time, we were helped out by the battalion's auto mechanic, Staff Sergeant Viktor Syrenko. We moved on. In the area of Liptal in front of the nose of the tankers, Hitlerites blew up the bridge over the river Malapane. The river was shallow, but the ford was mined. Having mined the ford and having repulsed the attack of the enemy, we again rushed after tanks. On the night of January 23rd, we reached the Oder south of Oppeln. Here the battalion radio, which had almost no breaks in work, began to receive codograms. Ordered to suspend work on the bridge and urgently move to the square 4738, reported on Oprienko. This is even further south, at Oderwinkel, also on the Oder. But we did not have to move to square 4738. The enemy suddenly counterattacked near the village of Alt-Bischofstal, and the battalion was ordered to follow the advanced detachment to the south. Fuel, Comrade Captain, is running out, reported Senior Sergeant Syrenko. Indeed, the rapid marching throws had already forced the drivers to drain fuel from barrels and jerry cans that the battalion carried with them. 2 or 3 more such throws and the tanks of cars will be empty, Cherkashin said anxiously. Having received air reconnaissance data, the tank corps suddenly turned from the main direction and, having made a detour, came to a small railroad station, where there was a German train with fuel. The appearance of Soviet tanks in the deep rear was so unexpected that the small German military unit and anti-aircraft gunners, scattered in panic, peacefully stood in positions left by the calculations of anti-aircraft artillery guns. On the tracks stretched a long row of tank cars with gasoline. Several German railroad workers, having recovered from the surprise, helped the battalion men to open the hatches of the tank. For the tankers, and for our battalion, it came in very handy. Having filled the tanks of the vehicles and taken a few barrels of gasoline, we set off again along the roads of Upper Silesia. On the road to Gleiwitz, the battalion was delayed in restoring the blown-up bridge over the Adolf Hitler Canal in the Walsen area. Entering a small mining village, we lost the road on which the tanks were moving. Having sent a reconnaissance, we made a halt. The inhabitants of the village without fear reached out to us, and elderly miners put on their festive uniforms and high black caps embroidered with galloon. They began to invite us to visit them. They greeted us as their own. Why would this? Perplexed the commander. So they are workers, explained Kochnev. It turns out, and refuse the invitation is inconvenient. But to visit the inhabitants of the village failed. As soon as it got dark, shots rang out from the neighbouring forest. Morontsev, who was breathing heavily, came running and reported. Hitlerites. We can assume up to a regiment of infantry. What was the enemy in front of us? It was unlikely that they were units retreating to the west. The front line was still far away. It was logical to assume that they were either reserves approaching the front line or just some rear unit. We were in the dark, but we understood perfectly well that the forces were very unequal, an infantry regiment and 2 incomplete companies of sappers. We had to get the vehicles behind the bridge and cover them. Start the engines, shouted Commander Cherkashinu. Together with the commander, we ran to the outermost cottages, from behind which Dubrovsky's company was already firing at the advancing troops. "Well, will you hold on, Alexei Vasilievich? The cars will pass through." And we through the canal. "It depends how long. 20 minutes, maybe I can hold out." The danger of being cut off by the enemy from the canal was growing by the minute Hitlerites broke into the mining village. Once during the battles, which we fought together with cavalrymen in the Carpathians, I already had to take off the banner from its shaft and hide it under my overcoat. That day in a German mining village I had to do it again. And the darkness of the winter night was getting denser and denser. Shooting away in the direction of the fire flashes, we moved to the canal, descended the vertical wall on the ice, and cautiously moved away from the village, listening to the sounds that reached us. The shooting continued. So Alyosha Dubrovsky is holding on. We got out of the deep channel about 4 kilometers from the village, and at dawn we saw an amphibian approaching us. Cherkashin had arrived. "I had never hoped to meet you," he shouted joyfully. We passed by a miracle. Cars in 5 kilometers, with a motorized rifle battalion. We reattached the banner to the flagpole. The battalion moved towards Gleiwitz. On the narrow road along the canal, a group of people approached us. Their striped clothes spoke for themselves. They were American pilots shot down and captured by the Nazis. After greeting us, they pushed a short, swarthy man out of the back rows. Breathing heavily from excitement, he could not begin to speak for a long time. I myself am an engineer from Minsk. I know a little English, and the camp commandant used me as an interpreter. Lately I've been living with Americans in the same barracks. They are good guys. When Soviet tanks appeared near the camp, the guards scattered in panic, and we easily got out. After indicating the route, we supplied the American pilots with galettes and canned food, warned them that there might be encounters with the enemy, and wished them a happy journey. Another meeting took place not far from the canal at a small farm near the forest. A solid house with a mezzanine and several large brick cowsheds testified to the prosperity of the owners of the farm. When we drove up, a woman in her 40s ran out of the nearest cowshed. "Oh, are they ours? My darlings." She rushed to us and started kissing our hands. Having calmed down our compatriot, we found out that she had been brought here from Bryansk region, that her name was Vera, and that she had recently passed her 20th year. Our words hardly reached the girl's consciousness. She kept looking around fearfully, and could not believe that we were not partisans, but a regular part of the Red Army, that the terrible dream was over, and she would soon return to her homeland. Silesian miners, captured American pilots, a girl from Bryansk region, taken away by fascists into slavery, different people and different fates, but they were bound together by a single chain, the name of which was war. Soon we caught up with the tankers, who were involved in street battles in the large industrial city of Gleiwitz. In the center of Gleiwitz, several buildings were burning. The glow of the fires brightly illuminated the adjoining streets. On the huge brick wall of one of the factory buildings, a figure symbolizing an eavesdropper was painted in black paint. Above it in large letters was an inscription in German: "Attention. The enemy is eavesdropping," and this black figure, and the text below it looked ominously ridiculous in that setting. Gleiwitz. This name was familiar to many. After all, the events that took place in Gleiwitz became the formal pretext for the outbreak of the Second World War. On the second day Gleiwitz was liberated. We received a new order, and on January 30th we started to cross the motorized infantry on the ice of the Oder north of Ratibor. The construction of the bridge for tanks began at night near the village of Heiser. The moon illuminated the place of work quite well. By dawn the upper structure of the bridge was already being laid. But then messes struck. Long and agonizingly fiddled soldiers with knockdown piles. And again messes bombed and destroyed the bridge. I was concussed and thrown into the thick of broken ice. I had to drink Oder water. Our sappers pulled me out. At that time Hitlerites attacked the bridge, and the icy cold of the river was replaced by the heat of battle. Having liberated Upper Silesia from the enemy, the 3rd Guards Tank Army rushed to the north, to Breslau. Together with it moved and our battalion. The new 300-kilometre throw of General Rabalko's tankers was even more impetuous. Forests and settlements flashed Birkenau, Gross-Stralitz, Wallau. On February 6th, the battalion arrived in the area of Steinowen and for the 5th time began to equip the bridge crossing over the Oder. It was urgent to strengthen the wooden bridge near the village of Lauban, a bridge that in its best days had a carrying capacity of 15 tons. Tanks and self-propelled vehicles of the 6th Guards Tank Corps, experiencing heavy bombing messers and Junkers, eagerly awaited the crossing. Battalion vehicles could not drive to the bridge. The problem of hauling frames and heavy runs arose. Having consulted, the commander and I decided to ask for help from the Corps commander. In the terrible rumble of shelling, in the noise of working tank diesels, we hardly made out the answer of the tank captain. There by the tree stands the deputy commander. Go to him. Which one is that? The tall one. He looks like a hero. And he's really a hero of the Soviet Union, and even twice. The young Major General Jakubowski bent towards us, trying to hear the combatants' report. Having shouted over the rumbling, he nonchalantly remarked, friends, no devil can disperse the tankers. Then, jumping into a shallow trench, the general dragged behind him Mysiakov and me. And when the messers, having dropped small bombs, turned to the west, he said, there is only one way out. I'll allocate people, they will carry me in their arms. Preserving the surviving part of the deck, the battalion brought wooden runs from the bottom of the bridge. Additional frames were installed, dragged along the thin ice of the river. Sappers in the icy water of the Oder drove these heavy frames into place. Those who worked in the water were changed every 15 to 20 minutes. The general himself went down under the bridge. Hurry, sappers, hurry. He hurried. They started the trial run of Su-76 self-propelled guns. The bridge was shaking. Will it fail? We reported our fears to the deputy commander. No, friends, I can't delay the crossing, he said firmly. I will launch tanks. We have already lost time and men. Reinforce the bridge from below while moving. Let's take the risk. The soldiers of the battalion continued to fasten the struts and scrims. The bridge shuddered under the tracks of tanks. The purlins were sagging about to break and crush the labourers' sappers. The soldiers took turns diving under the broken ice to fix the frames. There was no time to dry themselves. They would break away from the work for a minute, take a sip of alcohol from a flask and get back into the water or under the runs. The wet sappers were steaming. Deputy Commander of the 6th Guards Tank Corps, II. Jakubowski was directing tanks to the west. When the tank traffic jam began to dissolve, he leaned over the railing and shouted to us from above. Well, engineers, you see everything is normal. Your compromat is outdated. The war and the soldier and the tree successfully takes off 3 skins. On February 7th, the sun peeped through, but it was still chilly. The Oder breathed dampness, the shells had broken the ice, and the vapour was rising from the water in smoke. The sappers, who provided the crossing, had to warm up and dry themselves in the long-term firing points of the Steiner's fortified area. In such concrete coffins no messers and artillery raids are not scary, rejoiced the commander, inspecting the pillboxes. Steiner's fortified area was located at a steep bend of the Oder, about 30 kilometres northwest of Breslau. Powerful floor walls up to 2 metres thick, a system of concrete ledges to protect the entrances and dampen the blast wave, embrasures of close combat at the entrances, the layout of combat and auxiliary casemates, everything indicated that the pillboxes were built or modernised in the 30s. There are mines all around, reported Morontsev. You can use only one path. Following the battalion scouts, we walked along a narrow path between wire and mine barriers. Strips of reinforced concrete barriers against tanks in the form of pyramids and minefields stretched not only along the west bank of the Oder. The same barriers curved along the fronts between the strongholds, which included a complex of long-term structures. They were intended for circular defence. Barbed wire strings were fixed on metal bars. Passages in the barriers were arranged in the form of zigzags and ledges. It was impossible for an uninformed person to penetrate through them. The personnel of the battalion fell on branches thrown on the concrete floors of the combat casemates and on the few bunks that were in the lower living floors of the pillboxes. Everyone fell soundly asleep. Only I didn't sleep. Everything I had seen during the day stirred my thoughts, persistently brought me back to the past. Mysterious underground galleries, forts, fortresses. How mysterious and interesting it all is. And I, like many of my peers, was attracted to the fortress romance in my youth. Alma Mater Military Engineering Academy, named after V.V. Kuibyshev, gave me an opportunity to study not only watchtowers and fortifications of military camps of Roman legionaries, siege guns and castles, fortresses of feudal lords, but also forts of Ki. Velichko, long-term fortifications of Professors V.V., Yakovlev, S.A., Kamelkov, E.A., Yakovlev, whom I was lucky to see and hear. My diploma project was also devoted to one of the problems of advanced fortification preparation of the territory of the state. That's why, having found myself in the Steiners fortified area, I was so attentive and interested in everything I saw around me. The fortified areas, these modern fortresses, have not lived up to the hopes that were placed on them. But that was not their fault. They were intended to reinforce the most important areas in the overall defense system. The situation on the fronts was sometimes so that the advancing troops were operating on a wide front, and the defending troops did not have time to occupy their fortified areas with permanent, specially trained garrisons, which could more effectively use reinforced concrete and firepower of the structures. The advancing troops had already more than once either bypassed the SDSDS from the flanks or carried out their breakthrough in a narrow area, making extensive use of aviation and artillery. This is how events unfolded in June 1940 at the famous Maginot Line. The creation of this long-term system of modern fortresses on the northeastern border of the country was a reasonable measure to protect France from surprises and released large offensive forces. But the Nazi German troops bypassed the Maginot Line from the Belgian side through the Ardennes, where the line was not built because of the negative attitude to it Marshal Pétain. Lorraine, Alsace and Belfort fortified areas remained behind enemy lines. The application of a vicious, purely defensive strategy actually chained 40 divisions to the place. On the role played by the Maginot Line, which cost France a huge amount of money, experts have two opinions. Some believe that the fortified areas came out of the war undefeated, others that the Maginot Line did not fulfill the tasks assigned to it. I think we should agree with the first opinion. Many commanders and fortifiers believe that fortified areas are useful in both defensive and offensive warfare. Although fortresses cannot replace an army, they are the only means to slow the advance, weaken, embarrass and alarm a victorious enemy. The fate of the no less famous Siegfried Line on the western borders of Germany was different. The Nazis used it 3 times for cover during the Polish campaign of 1939 as a springboard for an offensive to the west in 1940, and to delay the Allies in 1944. The Siegfried Line was equipped with small-scale, long-term defences. It did not have such capital facilities as the Maginot Line, but was more developed in depth. American attempts to overcome it from the start, as is known, were not successful. And only in early 1945 the Nazis left the Siegfried Line. Steiner's fortified area occupied by the field troops was broken through by the Soviet army in several sections. Insurmountable defence of Hitlerites along the Oder was broken. From the bridgehead on the left bank of the Oder a new offensive was urgently prepared. On February 8th the enemy defence on the Steinovsky bridgehead was broken through. The Soviet armies moved to the west to Neisse and to the south bypassing Breslau. Our battalion together with tankers of General P.S. Rybalko kept the direction to Neisse, and soon we broke away from the general armies. German aviation intensified its actions on the columns of tankers, but the speed of the tanks was increasing. Behind remained Braunau, Großkotzenau, Madlau. Then at last forests began, and it became more difficult for the fidgety messers to detect us. On a forest road near Ruckenwaldau, there was a forestry near a snowy meadow. Near one of the houses stood several 30-Chevers. The passenger car of the battalion command also stopped here. Soon several more tanks and armoured personnel carriers came here as well. A stocky man in a black duffel coat and a high papaka hurriedly walked toward the tanks of the advanced detachment, which had arrived before us. "Start the engines," shouted one of the tankers. The hatch covers slammed shut. Diesel engines roared and the tanks moved along the clearing to the west. A military man in a half-coat looked at the distant combat vehicles and came towards us. That's when we first saw the legendary Commander Pavel Semyonovich Rybalko up close. Mysyakov ran towards him. "Comrade Commander, the separate engineering battalion follows." "How can it follow if you're standing still?" "Companies are coming, Comrade Commander." "That's another matter. Hurry up, combat. Time is precious. Every hour saves thousands of lives. To Boba, to Alt-Ols." By the evening of February 10th, the battalion went along the forest roads to the river Boba. More than 100 kilometers separated us now from the Oder. It got warmer. The snow melted in some places. The evening seemed quiet and gentle. The area near Alt-Ols resembled a fairy tale picture. The icebound river was divided by a small island with a group of ornate trees. The villages of Alt-Ols and Neu-Ols were connected by a narrow dirt road. It crossed a high embankment and led to 2 consecutive bridges. As in a real fairy tale, on the high bridges with collapsed spans in the moonlight began to climb, like gnomes, sappers. These were the men of Captain Drobnitsa's company. Before dawn on February 11th, the blown-up parts of the bridges were restored. It would have been possible to open the traffic. But suddenly there was some kind of commotion on the bridge. Machine gun bursts rang out. Tankers, having heard the shooting, hit the dam with their guns. As soon as it dawned, the contact from the platoon commander Lieutenant A. Kairulin reported that Efrieta Rosokin, seeing the attacking Hitlerites, jumped out on the dam and mowed down 2 of them with a machine gun. And Junior Sergeant Bilatov fought hand-to-hand with German soldiers who tried to prevent the restoration of bridges. Something a lot of Krolts who shot skeptically noted the commander, having listened to the contact. "A lot, or a little, Comrade Major, and 4 can be presented," reported an hour later Uskat Kairulin. The tankers who had been delayed on Boba began to catch up with the advanced units of the 52nd All-Volunteer Army. The commander of the tank battalion sought me out. "You see, Captain, how your sappers are failing. We should be on quays by now, but we're sitting here. The infantry is coming on our heels. We'll start letting them through. But the bridges have a carrying capacity of only 16 tons. They can't hold 34 trucks." "What's the matter now?" The tanker waved his hand. "I got the command to dismount. I'm going south. Goodbye, engineers. The radio said that shooters are on their way. Get them across these bridges." When it was quite light, the advance party of the 111th Rifle Division arrived. Su-76 self-propelled guns, vehicles with infantry and artillery, were let through the restored bridge crossing. On the western bank of the Boba, the bridgehead for further offensive was expanding. We remembered for a long time a small in its upper part tributary of the Oder the Boba. Just below the dam, sappers began to build a low water bridge for the passage of medium and heavy tanks. The task seemed to be not difficult. And indeed, in 18 hours a 48-metre long pile bridge was ready. The first to pass were about 10 tanks of the 6th Guards Tank Corps. Then a 122mm self-propelled artillery unit drove onto the bridge. At this time and began. As if an evil wizard lifted and broke the ice into small pieces. The ice floes ran down the stream with terrible speed, bumping into each other. The water level in the ice-cleared river began to rise. The water was foaming and churning. The speed of the current kept increasing. The river first touched the runs, then rushed over the bridge decking. The water rose even higher. The bridge became invisible. The self-propelled car, which had been moving for a minute, slid sideways off the bridge and disappeared under the water. The reason that the waters of the small Boba swallowed the heavy bridge was, of course, the water outlets sluiced in the upper reaches of the river. It was the Nazis who opened the floodgates, and great masses of water rushed downstream onto the bridge. Although I studied the course of hydraulic barriers at the academy, But I did not imagine then the full power of the hydraulic impact. When the water subsided, we saw that the upper structure of the bridge had been completely demolished. All the piles in the channel were torn out or bent. The mechanic driver of the self-propelled vehicle was dead, but never let go of the control levers. Reinforced by Army sappers from the 62nd OMIB, the battalion hammered the piles again during the night, and in the morning completed a new, but already tracked bridge. It was built 30 meters away from the demolished one, and everything happened again. A delay in crossing the tanks threatened terrible trouble. The planned pace of the offensive was thwarted. We decided to build a ferry crossing, but the Germans opened the upper locks again, and although the water pressure was not so strong, both piers for mooring ferries were half destroyed. The heavy ferry for tanks, collected by the pontooners, was carried far away from the crossing and crashed into the right bank of the river. The river system of the Boba Basin was sluiced by the Germans for peaceful purposes, but at that dangerous time the enemy skillfully used the presence of reservoirs and sluices located in the upper reaches of the river, opening gates of reservoirs during crossing of Soviet tanks. Hitlerites considerably delayed them. And narrow winged messers, suddenly appearing in the sky, clearly informed German military engineers about the moment of effective water release. And only on the third day we, together with the 128th Pontoon Bridge Battalion, managed to transport the tanks. These are the surprises the Little Beaver gave us. At the time when the strongest waterfall, arranged by the Nazis, was completing the destruction of our second low-water bridge for tanks, an open willies rolled up to the edge of the precipitous bank of the Boba. The head of engineering troops of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, Guards Colonel Matvey Polikarpovich Kamenchuk, easily jumped out of it. We delayed the crossing for 2 days. Hitler had time to transfer 2 divisions to our direction, he said unhappily. So who could expect? Shrugged his shoulders Mysyakov. The very fact of the arrival of the Army Nashinsha to us at the crossing showed that it is given importance on an army scale. Where is your radio? Air reconnaissance should immediately clarify the presence of water in the upper reservoirs. Otherwise, they'll just let us in. At the request of Nashinsha, aviation was engaged in reconnaissance and bombing of the sluices, which were in the hands of the Nazis. Colonel Kamenchuk always appeared unexpectedly and, as a rule, in difficult moments. Many times he caught up with the battalion, which was on the march or at the crossings, and it was not easy to drive a willies on the communications of the army, passing in the rear of the enemy, a colonel and a chauffeur, and 2 automatic rifles with them. That was the whole force that resisted all front surprises. We once wondered why he didn't have at least an armoured personnel carrier with him for protection. What jokers, grinned Nachins, and what to fight with in battalions. He was pleasantly surprised by his objectivity in relation to the attached units, kind care about them. Once, having arrived in the battalion at the end of a raid in Upper Silesia, Nachinj said, "Now you, as an example of the army sappers, put, and promised to give the battalion a rest." What a Nachinj! It's the first time I've seen attached sappers taken to the reserve. Usually they try to squeeze all the juices out of them and keep their own fresh. Mysyakov admired, having received the order to withdraw the battalion to the reserve in the area of Breslau. Somehow, not far from Gorlitz, a soldier came running. 207th? Comrade Captain, you are called the Guards Colonel. I saw Colonel Kamenchuk's willies on the early spring sun-soaked road. I made a detour to congratulate you, he said, gesturing to interrupt my report. With the order of Alexander Nevsky. I wish the battalion and you personally new successes. I saw Matvey Polikarpovich again only 13 years later at the gathering of chiefs of engineering troops. He was already a lieutenant general, chief of engineering troops of one of the major military districts, and shared his experience in organizing combat training. Although the advanced detachments of the tank, followed by the general army formations, approached Boba, the front line remained far behind us. Hitler's units and detachments were snooping around along the communications, causing a lot of trouble. The rear units suffered most of all. We also faced it in our battalion. The Chief of Financial Allowance Senior Lieutenant, i.e., Boyko went to get a salary for the personnel. We did not need money at that time, but it was necessary to issue certificates to families. Well, order is order, and he left to return with the money on the 15th. A day later, the soldier who had accompanied Boyko returned. The senior lieutenant was badly wounded, right in the eye. What happened? We were travelling by hitchhiking. At night, 30 kilometers away from the forest, the Krolts came from the woods. From the hospital I received a letter from Ivan Yermolaevich. In it he described the fight with Hitlerites. He and the accompanying soldier were saved by unexpectedly arrived tankers. And there were such things. In one of the nights on Boba, together with pontooners, arrived the commander of the 19th Army Engineer Sapper Brigade, Colonel Soldatenkov. I don't like this damn place. We have to see Gross-Golnisch. Having said that, he jumped into a Willys and drove off with the chauffeur into the greenish darkness of the night. We knew that Gross-Golnisch, a poor wooden workers' village, had been abandoned by the inhabitants. It is not pleasant to enter empty settlements, the brigade commander told us afterwards. There is not a soul around, only dogs howling. Housing, whatever it is, must be occupied by people. But that's just for the record. I walked past the houses to the Beaver. The moon was shining brightly, you could see everything like in the daytime. The ice on the river was broken by waterholes. The place for crossing is obviously suitable. The approaches are good, but the river is wider there. And the silence, by the way, is so quiet that it's creepy. Whether for this reason or for some other reason, my heart clenched uneasily. I looked around. No one. And I felt that someone was watching me. Well, I think nerves. Soldatenkov was not deceived by his premonition. The darkness of the night was cut by a short burst of gunfire. It was dangerous to stay on the shore, and he began to cautiously make his way to the car. Pressing himself against the shadowy wall of the house, the colonel saw a group of German soldiers pass a few steps away from him. Looking around fearfully, they went down to the broken ice to cross the Beaver. When he reached the car, the chauffeur was dead. I grabbed Fedin's automatic rifle and hit the ice floes from behind the house. Soldatenkov finished his sad story. I felt sorry for Fedor. He was a golden boy. We did not notice how spring came among the fighting troubles, and when we looked around we were surprised. Small buds on the trees. In the fields, large thawed patches appeared on the greying snow, and the first grass timidly sprouted on them. The southern wind carried the head-dizzying odours of fresh greenery and tree resin. These days the battalion was subordinated to the 7th Guards Tank Corps, which fought in the northern part of the town of Lauban. To cut the communications of the Silesian group of Hitlerites, and to prevent the use of the railroad Gorlitz-Glatz, it was necessary to seize the city and the railway station of Lauban. For this purpose it was still required a very small effort. However, the situation suddenly changed dramatically. The German fascist command transferred reinforcements to the city, including units of the traitor Vlasov. Street battles broke out, stubborn, bloody, for every house and floor. The Vlazovites fought with the frenzy of the doomed. Faustniks in the houses shot tanks from the windows. Faustpatrons were also used on buildings occupied by our units. Assault groups acted even from the roofs of neighbouring houses. In order to smoke out the enemy, holes were punched in the walls with the help of charges, and grenades and smoke bombs were thrown into them. 2 companies of sappers of our battalion were involved in the street battles. A soldier confident led us through the yards, floors and attics to the commander of the 23rd Guards Motorized Rifle Brigade, Colonel A. Golovachov. The energetic, thin-skinned Kombrig leaned out the attic window. Turning from time to time to us his face with sharply defined chin, he showed us in what place it was necessary to blow up the walls of one of the houses in which the Vlasovites had settled, and where it was better to cover the nearest alley with mines. As the attack of the Vlasovites began, they were in German uniforms with rower stripes. Faust patrons squealed, cannons coughed. In the infernal noise of the battle there were shouts and groans of the wounded. We descended into a stone sack, well surrounded by gloomy brick houses. Through the massive walls came the deafening echoes of close combat. Here, in the courtyard, we parted with Mysyakov. He went back to Golovachev, and I went to the headquarters car, camouflaged in the bushes near the edge of the city. An hour and a half passed. On the radio received a Kodogram battalion to move to mines in the area of Levenberg. I sent liaisons to the companies and to the commander. Mysyakov did not appear at once. It turns out that while he was making his way to Golovachev, the enemy occupied the first floor. Fights began in the attic. Mysyakov and some captain got out through the roof of a neighbouring house. Kombrig Golovachov stayed behind. Meanwhile, the enemy had already occupied the second floor. "And do you know what Kombrig did?" excitedly asked Mysyakov. In front of the enemy, he went down to the ground on a rope. "That's how it is, Captain." It was the third day of fighting. The Vlasevites intensified their attacks, and the Junkers were raging in the sky. The Germans continued to transfer considerable forces of tanks and infantry to Lauban. From here they launched a strong counterattack to meet their encircled 20,000 group in Glogau. Here north of Lauban, I heard about the death of twice hero of the Soviet Union Alexander Alexeyevich Golovachev. This sad news was told by MP Kamenchuk, head of engineering troops of the 3rd Guards Tank Army, who witnessed the last minutes of Golovachev's life. The 23rd Brigade was trying to hold off the enemy onslaught north of Lauban. The brigade commander was with Su-76 self-propelled vehicles and directed their fire. At that time, a shell of a German tank hit one of our fighting vehicles. The scattered fragments hit Golovachev. When the battalion's convoy was following a country road to the next mining line at Levenberg, we were overtaken by several tanks and self-propelled guns. We stopped the vehicles near a group of trees. Nearby, one of the 30 Chevas turned off its engine. Tanks of the 7th Guards Tank Corps passed us by. "Stand up, engineers," shouted the commander of the tank that stopped next to us. "Now a car with the body of Kombrig Golovachev will pass by." The front line stretched from Gorlitz to Breslau and Breslau. Hitlerites continued to counterattack, and at Gorlitz, and in the direction of the remaining 30 to 40 kilometers behind Breslau. Our battalion was urgently transferred there for mining the left flank of the front. Breslau is a small Silesian town located on a hilly area. The old town hall and buildings of the German Gothic era peacefully coexisted in it, with houses of modern architecture. Cottages with traditional tiled roofs, framed by gardens, are nestled on the outskirts. One of them housed the battalion headquarters. The war had bypassed this town. Even some symbolism could be seen in it, after all. Here, in Breslau, Kutuzov died. We mined south and west of the city. A few kilometers from Breslau, on the road to Gorlitz, just near our minefields, we saw a modest roadside stone with the name of Field Marshal. And away from the road near the village of Obertallendorf there was a monument in the form of a wreck of a column. According to legend, the heart of the commander is buried there. On one of the days of our stay in Breslau, we decided to see the town and the monument to Kutuzov. Walking along the white stone wall, behind which hid a low bell tower, we stopped, attracted by the noise. Our military patrol was knocking at the heavy, metal-clad vaulted gate. The metal deadbolt creaked, and the head of a young nun in a white starched headdress appeared in the oval opening. In the metal frame of the observation window she looked like a beautiful icon. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," said the icon in the purest Russian language. "This is a convent. The abbess earnestly asks you not to enter. It's forbidden." "Are you Russian?" exclaimed the patrol officer in surprise. "I am a servant of the Lord," answered evasively the nun. "But how do you know Russian so well?" "There are many things here connected with Russia and the Russian language." "Such as what?" "Here, gentlemen, Prince Golenishev Kutuzov fought and died, and a part of his mortal body rests in this land." We went on. On a small square, squeezed by 2-storied stone buildings, there was a cast-iron obelisk. 4 metal lions guarded the monument, on which an inscription was cast in Russian and German. Up to this place Commander Kutuzov brought victorious Russian troops, but here death put a limit to his glorious deeds. He saved the fatherland and opened the way for the liberation of Europe. May the memory of the hero be blessed. On the other two sides of the obelisk, listed orders of the commander-in-chief. Returning that spring day on the outskirts of Breslau, in the battalion headquarters, we found the deputy commander of the brigade on political part, Lieutenant Colonel Asaboyakin. And I'm here on urgent business. Mysyakov want to present to a high award. I came for the material. In vain. We're not fighting for medals. Embarrassed, Commander. In vain or not in vain, not your sorrow, hero. Case solved. Not good will be if it turns out on the principle all medals, and we did not give. It may be true, agreed Mysyakov. But it's not about awards, really. And you, Commander, are a philosopher. But that's what war is all about. Orders do not exist for nothing. The Order of Kutuzov, for example. Have you seen the monument to him? Have you read the newspaper today? More than 130 years separated us from the events associated with the death of the great commander. On that day, the army newspaper reminded us of his words, "Let's finish the defeat of the enemy on his own fields." Then, in the 45th, they sounded quite relevant. It smelled intoxicatingly of spring. It came not only exactly according to the calendar. It was felt in nature, in the hearts of people, in the atmosphere of approaching victory. And although the troops of the front went on the defence, and on the left flank at Gorlitz and Lauban even somewhat withdrew, although in the rear of our troops remained major strongholds of the enemy Breslau and Glogau, we knew victory is near. The Allied armies spared no effort to be the first to break through to Vienna from Italy, and to Berlin from Belgium and France. And Hitler's command was trying to stabilize the situation on the Eastern Front. All reserves were involved, the mobilization was carried out, the Volkssturm was created, which included everyone from boys to old men. In these spring days our battalion was withdrawn from the operational subordination of the commander of the 3rd Guards Tank Army. With tankers we passed more than 1,100 kilometers. 60 days of tank rushes through the enemy rear, battles at the crossings and meetings are forever etched in my memory as the most different meetings. With former prisoners of concentration camps, with liberated prisoners of war our compatriots, French, Czechs, British. Hundreds and thousands of people came to the movement. They were so accustomed to walk only in formation, in columns, under the shouts of the overseers, that even after their liberation they habitually huddled together. And how many meetings with Russian and Ukrainian girls who bent their backs in a foreign land, serving the estates of wealthy grossbauers. More than a quarter of a century has passed since then, and I still cannot forget the torn bodies of our compatriots on the streets of German cities. This terrible sight stopped tank columns like a minefield. Not far from Gorlitz we met a group of girls with yellow six-pointed stars on their robes. The girls spoke Polish. They told us that they were in one of the Nazi camps where they sewed soldiers' uniforms for 14 hours a day. One of them, thin and black-eyed, pulled off the sackcloth of her robe, and we saw a star tattooed on her breast. The girls had undergone a monstrous operation. They survived by chance, but none of them will ever know the joys of motherhood. German refugees could also be seen on the roads. Having loaded wheelbarrows with household goods, taking children and old people with them, taking cows and dogs, they went westward into the unknown. The stats and Dorfs changed. In the settlements along the roads, stone houses with red-tiled roofs stood in rows. Almost every wealthy house had books, and among them unnecessarily luxurious editions of Mein Kampf, with portraits of Hitler aforehead, as if cut by bangs to the eyebrows, cold, prickly eyes, strained, unnatural smile. The author of the book was still alive then. As soon as the battalion returned to the 42nd Independent Motorized Engineer Brigade and settled not far from Breslau, we were visited by the Deputy Brigade Commander Head of the Political Department, Lieutenant Colonel Adboyarkin. "You have settled in nicely," said Lieutenant Colonel, looking around the large room of one of the cottages occupied by the battalion headquarters. "And what a library! Well, here are the books of the leaders of the Third Reich. Have you ever read them? Mein Kampf or something. Anatoly Mikhailovich." Mysyakov inquired. "Yes, if I even knew German, even then I would not read." "What for?" This fascist explosive has only one way to go into the oven. You're right about the explosives. It's a book mine. Don't think that all Germans were interested in the Führer's writings. That's not why there's a book in almost every house. The secret here is simple. Mein Kampf was published in colossal editions and distributed in a forced manner. What can I say? It was even given to newlyweds as a wedding gift from the imperial authorities. Hitler's order not to step back led to the fact that under the threat of death, the commanders of formations continued to hold some settlements that were far behind our troops. After unsuccessful attempts to break through the encirclement on April 1st, surrendered besieged garrison Glogau, and 20,000 people laid down their arms. But Breslau still held on. German fascist troops stubbornly defended this 1,000-year-old city on the Oder, which was an important port and a major industrial centre, and therefore was of great military importance. We arrived at Breslau when the German Army Corps of about 40,000 men was still hiding behind a system of long-term and field fortifications and a dense web of mine blast barriers. The reason for the steadfastness of the Breslau garrison was explained not only by Hitler's order and not even by the arrival of his special representative. The point here was something else. The distance between the defensive outline of Breslau and the front line of Hitler's troops was only 20 to 25 kilometers, and on the shortest way from Breslau, at the front edge of the enemy, was a natural fortress, Mount Zobten, a sharp wedge entering our defence from the side of Schweinstadt. The presence of this visual connection strengthened the hopes of the besieged garrison. The enemy attempted a simultaneous counterattack from the direction of Breslau and Zobten, but our troops repelled all attacks. Hitlerites failed to get through. Time was lost, and the garrison of Breslau was firmly trapped in the besieged city. In addition, the Soviet artillery almost round the clock was firing on the southern positions of the defensive encirclement of Breslau. This did not allow the enemy to accumulate forces to strike in the direction of Zobten. Few people knew then that on the outskirts of Breslau, not only shells sent by artillery and Katyusha were bursting. The Sapper artillery also worked there. And the result was this. Not far from the city, Hitlerites threw hundreds of thousands of artillery shells and aerial bombs during their retreat. Our troops had a problem how to deal with them. It was impossible to use the captured shells for their intended purpose because of the difference in calibers. Most of the aerial bombs did not have fuse sets. It was difficult and complicated to destroy such a large amount of ammunition. That's when the idea arose to try to send them back to their rightful owners. Engineer artillery had been used before Breslau and was not the monopoly of our brigade. It was successfully used by engineering units of other fronts. To launch, trophy shells were equipped with ramps, cut into the ground at a certain angle. Simple boards served as guides. Bomber charges and warhead fuses were detonated with the help of electric detonators by a detonating machine. The sappers who set it in motion were in the shelter. Deceleration of the projectile explosion was regulated by the length of the firing cord in the warhead. The accuracy of firing, of course, was far from ideal. But the fire on the area, on a given square, as a rule, was provided. Some units of our brigade were involved in the development of Sapper artillery. Officers of the 34th Separate Electrical Engineering Battalion had to study in this connection many types of German artillery shells and bombs, and they mastered the unfamiliar business perfectly. But perhaps the greatest experts in the field of Sapper artillery were the officers of the 211th Separate Company of Special Mines. Its commander, Engineer Captain V. Lilakoff, enthusiastically undertook to master Sapper torpedoes. "What are you?" Vladimir Evgenievich, the glory of Katyusha going to eclipse. Captain N.P. Badev, Chief of Staff of the 209th OMIB, often encouraged Lilakoff. "For you, diggers, we are trying." "Enough of your miners, Nikolai Petrovich, with every mine. A torpedo is thrown explosion. And the passage in the mines is ready, just like in a fairy tale." Many doubted. The head of the brigade's technical department, Major Engineer E.A. Katurkin, a tall thin man with a smile of a good-natured skeptic, joked. "Everything changes. Dialectics. Siege artillery was born of engineering art, and modern artillery created engineering." The reasoning of the engineering major was not without a touch of skepticism, but this did not prevent him, a former adjunct of the Military Engineering Academy, to make a number of interesting proposals related to the development of Sapper artillery, including Sapper torpedoes, the basis for which served as rocket-propelled shells. The first 100-kilogram Sapper torpedoes flew into the territory occupied by the enemy as early as July 1944 in the area northwest of Tarnopol. It was a very spectacular sight, both smooth movement of the torpedo and strong explosions, accompanied by the appearance of large shreds of fire. "Everything sweep away on the ground, Sapper airships," respectfully said the infantryman, "and people and mines and guns." Sapper torpedoes played a modest but positive role. With their help not only provided many passages in minefields, the use of Sapper torpedoes had a depressing effect on the Nazis, and this is also important in the war. As for pelting the enemy with his own shells, in other words, the use of Sapper artillery, its value in some cases was quite significant, especially in 1945 during the siege of Breslau. Here it was often used and expediently supplemented the efforts of the barrel artillery and Katyushas. After numerous marching maneuvers and dynamic fighting with tankers, our battalion moved to a sedentary life. Almost 50 days we spent in a 20-kilometer strip, then called the buffer zone, between Zobten and Breslau. This zone was a real basket for shells. Artillery mines of 6-barrel German mortars and shells were falling from above, and below underfoot were their own engineering mines. The battalion arrived to mine the front line and the nearest depth of defence at the site of Mono, Zobten, in the bands of the 9th Guards Rifle Division of the 5th Army and the 120th Rifle Division of the 21st Army. "Why are you teasing the Kraut? You can see everything like on the palm of your hand." "Now because of you he will start hammering again," shouted to us from a camouflaged trench artillery officer. Indeed, our reconnaissance was disrupted by a heavy hail of artillery shells and mines. We quickly took cover in shallow trenches flooded with meltwater. "Is it impossible to cut this blister?" I asked. We stormed several times. The people were laid down, and T-Sopten still hangs over us like a kite. They say that the mountain is riddled with underground passages, and the old fortress on it is a nunnery. The Krauts have made a good home there. Perhaps nowhere else have we encountered such difficult conditions for mining as at Zobten. In front of the mountain, which seemed to be artificially built by people, there was flat terrain, only in some places covered with stunted bushes. It was difficult for the miners, harder, perhaps, than on the southern phase of the Kursk Bulge, but the general situation was quite different, and the mines were placed not in the native land, but in a foreign land. Then we had to install several minefields on the front line near Mount Zobten. When, having arrived in the 3rd Company, I specified the tasks for mining, Captain N.S. Drobnica only shook his head. "You, comrade captain, commanded the company yourself, know the conditions of work no worse than ours, and you say a marvel. Even departments of our mine ace 30 mines a night will not set." Let's listen to the aces themselves. Call them. The first to enter the low door of the dugout was Sergeant N. Largin, a man of about 45 with grey whiskers and big bald spots. Largin belonged to those soldiers who responded vividly to all important battalion affairs and events. Usually calm, even imperturbable, he came to me one day in the winter of 1943/44, unusually agitated. "I don't know what the bosses think. He can see better from above." "I'm talking about mines," the sergeant said then. "You can't paint them the same colour in winter and summer. You can't put green mines in the winter. And under the snow it is easier for the enemy to find such a surprise. It's no good. Write to your superiors, Comrade Captain Largin was considered to be a very experienced miner. By the way, contrary to the theory of probabilities, he passed along the front line from Don to Elba without a single wound or contusion." "Arrived on your orders," reported Largin, baggy saluting and taking off his cap. "You, Sergeant, can be heard from a kilometre away." "It's nothing. When I go on a mission, I take measures to ensure that there is no ringing," smiled Largin, looking at his chest, where the Order of Glory and 4 medals for bravery. The second arrived mine, Ace Sergeant Ivan Scharf, a large and very agile, despite the fullness, a man. And here is our hero with some special warmth, said the company. Barely Scharf opened the door. Pribov, Comrade Capitan. I see that you have arrived. I'm glad. And addressing me, Drobnitsa added, I like people like our sergeant. He's a balanced man, he won't blink at shelling, and will approach an unfamiliar mine without fear. You could send Scharf to Zobten too, but I'm afraid that his appearance will disturb the inhabitants of the convent, said the company with a smile. He is a prominent man. Against such an eagle even the nuns will not resist. Enough joking, Drobnitsa changed to a serious tone. We've laughed and it will be over. The Chief of Staff gives the company a new task. We need to consult, whether in these conditions we can put 300 mines a night. The nights are bright. The main thing is to plant the mines secretly to the place of work. Otherwise the Kraut will see them and be surprised, said Largin. It's true, confirmed Scharf. In the night is like in the day. There are bushes and broken barns in this area. Maybe we should try to deliver the mines in the daytime. Largin suggested, pointing at the map. Mascuvati Treba. What's a soldier's cunning for? We could, for example, tie branches on our backs. Near Zobten, we immediately conducted a daytime experiment. It was successful. Then we went further in the daytime. We organized the feeding of anti-tank mines to the minefield with the help of blocks and rope. And it worked. Thanks to the personal example of mine, ace sappers of Captain Drobnitsa's company for a few days installed almost 1,500 mines. Many miners were characterized not only by boundless courage. They were distinguished, I would say, some kind of thirst for risk. In our battalion, this quality, in my opinion, possessed first of all our scouts Senior Sergeant A, Rysis and Sergeant P, Provorov. I have not once seen how the sergeant behaved before going on a mission. When he was sent, for example, to reconnoitre passages in enemy minefields, Rysis first silently rubbed the palms of his long hands, then somehow concentrated and shrank, as if mentally imagining a meeting with danger, in which much depended not only on himself, but also on blind chance. He loved the night, perhaps because, like many miners, he could navigate perfectly in the dark, and besides, he was characterized by instant reaction and was endowed with a mysterious sixth sense of danger. And not by chance, when it was necessary to scout the enemy minefields in front of the mountain T-Sopton, where the usual danger was aggravated by the very situation, we sent to the task Rysis and Provorov. Fritz puts mines thickly. The senior sergeant soon reported the results of the reconnaissance. Along the front 4 meters, and 3 meters deep. One mine with a bottom fuse found. To those who, like Rysis and Provorov, constantly looking for one-on-one combat with danger, undoubtedly belonged to us Captain A. Dubrovsky killed Captain D, Gigolov and Senior Lieutenant A. Ivanov Senior Sergeants A, Solier, A. Shabak, and some other miners. The most surprising thing is that this quality manifested itself not only in men. Arriving near T-Sopton to the headquarters of the Sapper Battalion of the Rifle Division to familiarize ourselves with the mines installed before us, we were surprised to hear that our escort would be a girl. Get acquainted, said the Chief of Staff of the battalion, Captain Igashev, introducing a pretty blonde-haired girl. This is our Joan of Arc. And her name is just Anya. You're at it again, Comrade Captain, the girl flared up. What kind of Joan of Arc am I? Don't be angry, Anya. The commander is calling me. You'll have to escort the captain and his comrades to the front line. Show me the boundaries of the minefields. Anya Voronko, who was acting as the assistant to the battalion chief of staff, had an excellent sense of the terrain and confidently led us to the target along the ditches covered with bushy branches. It was afternoon. The enemy temporarily weakened artillery attacks. Soldiers and officers of the Rifle Division, past whose trenches we were sneaking, recognized Anya and let us pass unhindered. The front trench at one of the sites passed near the barns. The Nazis were about 200 meters away from us. Anya knew it, and as if she was teasing them, testing their fate, running from one barn to another. Run here. You see the trunk of a broken tree, that's the corner of the left front of the minefield, shouted Voronko. The Germans suddenly stopped firing, I demanded that Anya stop unnecessary runs. "Your alarm is in vain, comrade captain," calmly, without a shadow of a drawl, replied the girl. At the end of the war, when the victory was already close, to take risks was not given to everyone. The sun had warmed the ground. The buds on the trees were bursting, throwing out young leaves. Warm days heralded a close summer, and the bulletins were more and more tuned to a speedy victory. But our battalion still continued to fill the warm black earth with mines. We installed wooden anti-tank mines TMD-44, which were a modification of the familiar TMTB of 1943. Along with wooden ones, we also installed trophy metal TMI, with which our miners willingly worked. On May 2nd, Berlin fell, but only at 18 hours on May 6th, the commander of the defense of Breslau, General Nikov, realizing that further resistance is useless, surrendered the fortress city on the Oder. The battalion was ordered to immediately begin demining Breslau. At dawn on May 7th, I with 2 scouts and a radio operator went by amphibian to the city. It was necessary to determine the areas of demining and places of cantonment of companies. Having passed the barrier zone through a wide passage guarded by our and German miners, who were to hand over to us the minefields they had set up, the amphibious vehicle passed the broken buildings of the outskirts. The central part of the city was almost unscathed. The traces of the 100-day siege were scarcely visible here. A column of soldiers moved down the street straight toward us. Grey uniforms. Black automatic rifle barrels. Our little group found itself face to face with a battalion of the enemy. The driver involuntarily braked. Each of us felt a twinge in our hearts, and the Germans, after 2 steps, saluted us. Shit, we sighed with relief. It's surrender. The amphibian stopped on a huge deserted square, not far from the medieval cathedral. Picturesque houses with high-coloured tiled roofs peeked out from behind the green trees. We randomly walked toward one of them. We rang the bell. After the 3rd or 4th ring, an obviously frightened Catholic priest opened the door. After calming him down, we quickly arranged for the soldiers to be housed. But it was not necessary to take advantage of the kindness of the owner of the house. The radio operator, who was in the car with a radio, transmitted the order of the commander urgently return. The previously given order of the brigade cancelled. The advanced units of the 2nd Polish Army were entering the ancient city on the Oder. The battalion headquarters continued to be located between Breslau and Zobten in the small village of Landau, with good 2-story stone houses, a tiny church and a granite monument to the soldiers who died on the fields of the First World War. From afar, beyond the greening plain, in the blue haze stood out the contours of Mount Zobten. All of us lived in nervous anticipation. The battalion's radios were on 24-hour reception. The ether was roaring. Everything was mixed up in it. Intriguing multilingual warnings about the upcoming transmission of an important message were replaced by greetings Viva, Ivan, then the mournful music of Wagner, which was transmitted by fascist stations. On the night of May 9th, after hours of waiting, we finally heard the official announcement of the surrender of Nazi Germany. Although we waited for this news for a long time, we did not believe it at once. We ran to the neighbouring part. The whole network of military radio stations was working. Breaking radio discipline, Maple congratulated on the victory of the Falcon. Someone shouted greetings. Someone announced toasts on the radio. All night on May 9th there was hell shooting in the air, flares were thrown. A spontaneous salute in honour of the victory of Soviet arms was seen far away. Victory. The end of the war. It seemed that everything had to change instantly. But on May 9th at the front near Zobten the situation remained the same. Here rose was our infantry to accept the surrender of parts of the 17th Army Corps, but the enemy opened heavy fire, showing that he did not intend to surrender. Our units suffered heavy losses and withdrew to the original positions. The commander of Army Group Centre, Field Marshal General F. Schorner, received an order of general surrender, but did not obey it, and German soldiers, under threat of execution, carried out the orders of their commander. However, already on the night of May 10th, part of the troops from his 600,000th group began to withdraw, trying to break through to the west. Schorner saved German soldiers. Our battalion was ordered to ensure the advance of parts of the 21st Army through the Carpathians to Prague. We had to neutralize mine blast barriers on the roads. We began to make passages on the section of Mono, T-Sopton. The enemy barriers immediately opened fire. But after a few hours the fire began to subside, and then became silent. The German covering barrier left the mountain T-Sopton. Infantry mines covered them, reported Senior Lieutenant Moromtsev. Old acquaintances Shumeninen. Mines again for the birthday party. Infantry, damn them, grumbled NS Drobnitsa. Take into account, boys, he warned his miners. The Lord God, creating a man, forgot to provide him with spare parts. The troops of the 21st Army passed through the passages in the minefields and moved through the Carpathians to the south and southwest into Czechoslovakia. We still stayed at the minefields, widening and fencing the passages. Then companies of the battalion also moved on the road and in the area of Waldenburg caught up with the army units. Trying to break away from the Soviet troops, the enemy littered the roads with mines, covering them with fire barrages of rearguards. Look, comrade captain, the mine toilet bowls have been discovered. What a marvel, intriguingly reported Drobnitsa at the village north of Nerod. Should we risk demining one for the museum? They were bulky earthenware mines TMI 4531, really resembling toilet bowls, covered in the middle with a round lid, under which there was a fuse. The thing is that in 1945 the Nazis used even enterprises that made ceramics for the production of mines. On narrow sections of mountain roads, and in some places in populated areas, our miners encountered at that time with new methods of obstacles. To close passages the enemy used huge concrete cubes and tetrahedrons, which by exploding a tipping charge of explosives at the last minute collapsed onto the roadway. Here the enemy planted mines in small groups on the roads and bypasses. Having passed over the ridge, we crossed the Czechoslovak border for the 4th time. Ahead of us was the Czech town of Trutnov. We took down 20 mines. One with a bottom fuse went off. A soldier was killed and 2 wounded. Reported Senior Lieutenant V. Dolgov, who took over the company from Captain Dubrovsky, who went to study. Those bitches. They put them on unrecoverability. The miners were indignant. The fighting was quieting down. The group of Schorner's troops, surrounded east of Prague, had nothing left but surrender. This happened on May 11th. That's why for 3 days after the victory the battalion continued to lose men. They died not only from the explosions of surprises and mines, set to be unrecoverable, but also from the enemy's fire. Signing funerals after the victory was especially painful and difficult. We arrived in Prague at noon on May 12th, 1945. We saw the central streets crowded with people. There was universal jubilation in the city. As soon as the amphibious vehicle stopped, we were literally dragged out of the car. A tanker in a helmet was being carried by hand. He managed to shout, "We've got you too, fellow countrymen. Nazdar." They shouted around us. The Praggers had us in a ring. A table was immediately vacated in one of the nearest beer halls. Quarts of foaming Pilsner beer appeared, which was discussed 8 months ago at Krosno. Beer now is not what it was before the war, the Praggers apologized. In Russian, but with a strong Czech accent, they told us. On May 5th, the citizens of Prague revolted. It started at the Skoda Smychov, Walter, ETA factories. The fascists threw tanks on the barricades. Thank you, the Russians came. At the most critical moment of the Prague uprising, the advanced units of the First Ukrainian Front approached the city and fought on the outskirts. And on the night of May 9th, Soviet tanks burst into Prague. After having a beer, we, accompanied by hospitable Prague citizens, went to see their ancient city. Especially memorable for me was the ancient Charles Bridge. From it we admired the waters of the majestically flowing Vltava and the high walls of Hradčany for a long time. It seemed to all of us then that somewhere very near was the grey history itself. The long-awaited peace had come. The territory of Germany, divided into 4 occupation zones, was occupied by the troops of the Soviet Union, the United States of America, Great Britain and France. As part of the troops of the Soviet zone was our battalion. Peaceful life began for soldiers and officers of our unit. But we often jumped up in the middle of the night. It seemed that the war was still going on, taking the sounds of the camp trumpet playing "Wake Up." As a signal of alarm, many rushed to the weapons, which were now installed in closed pyramids. They only came to their senses when they were convinced that everything was quiet, that there was no war, that the Saxon pines were peacefully sounding overhead, and that the water was splashing quietly in the deep lake below, near the camp. Our camp was not far from the Elbe east of Dresden, which was in ruins. Fires were still burning in the city. The air was saturated with the stench of smoking ruins. Ornate pavilions of the palace ensemble Zwinger, elegant church Hofkirche, hundreds of other city buildings, picturesque city parks and intricate bridges over the Elbe. Everything was disfigured by the war. Especially suffered from American aircraft Altstadt, the old town on the left bank of the Elbe, rich in architectural monuments of the XVII century. Saxony, sung by poets, had not yet cooled down from the fires of war. On the frosted windows of the bank in Bautzen could be seen spider images of swastikas. On a sunny May afternoon, with a group of officers from our brigade, I arrived in Berlin. We were surrounded by skeletons of houses. Somewhere in the piles of bricks were digging rare citizens. In the streets adjacent to the zoological garden, monkeys jumped through the trees. We passed the shattered Brandenburg Gate, visited the shattered Reichstag, took pictures on its roof. And then the massive building of the famous Imperial Reichschancellery grew up in front of us, looking at us with narrow slits of embrasures, which were blackened in the closed window openings. We entered the Reichschancellery from a side entrance. An eagle with a swastika, knocked down from somewhere, was lying under our feet. After walking through the empty halls of the Reichschancellery, along a long high corridor, we found ourselves in the office of the Führer. Here I remembered those who had died. I remembered how Company Commissar Volodya Nazarov had dreamed of visiting Hitler's residence. But Volodya didn't make it to Berlin. Zhigalov and Barabashov didn't make it. Many people didn't make it. The Reichschancellery had several floors underground. In the underground shelter, where a narrow escalator led, it was dark and damp. Reddish water flooded the rooms of the bunker, where Hitler spent his last hours. Now, on the place where the Imperial Chancellery used to be, one can see a green overgrown wasteland resembling a huge grave mound. The 1,000-year Reich, which was trumpeted by fascist ideologists, existed for 12 years. And these years entered into the history of mankind one of the blackest pages. After the thunder of battles in Germany established a peaceful silence. Apathy, caused by the shocks experienced, gradually replaced by Germans' hope for a better future. Many people in Saxony were looking for an opportunity to talk to us about their tomorrow. Germany was waking up from its slumber, the 12-year dark sleep of the fascist regime and the wars. Time was doing its work. Recent military events were fading into history. The new Germany was beginning a new life. Soon our engineering brigade was placed at the disposal of the commander of the central group of Soviet troops. It was to be redeployed to Austria. Austria, just like Germany, was divided into 4 zones. The entire eastern part of that country, including much of Lower Austria and Bergen, was a zone of the Soviet Union. In 1945, there were about 1 million foreign labourers and prisoners of war in Austria of 6 million people. Dozens of death camps were housed here, and among them Mauthausen, in which on February 18, 1945 died a professor of our military engineering academy, General Dmitry Mikhailovich Karbyshev. It was already beginning to get dusk when the battalion convoy pulled into the northern left bank suburb of Vienna-Floridsdorf. We drove past the neat 2-story houses of the suburb. There was relatively little destruction, but the buildings had a neglected look. The Danube soon came into view. All the bridges that connected Vienna with Floridsdorf had collapsed into its murky and swift waters. The automobiles moved across one of the 2 temporary military bridges. We entered Old Vienna shortly before evening. On the Prater, the ruined buildings and bridges over the canal were conspicuous. This marred the beauty of the peculiar city, sung by the waltzes of Strauss. At that time, the Austrian capital was home to about a quarter of the population of the entire country. Vienna remained not only a major industrial, but also a cultural centre. Life in it was getting better at a fairly rapid pace. Especially booming flourished Theatre Vienna. Austrian newspapers enthusiastically reported that Marshal Konev gave the city an echelon of cement for the restoration of the Opera House, and thanked the Red Army for this gift. The palace of Emperor Franz Joseph then housed the Red Army officers' home. The throne room became an auditorium, and we often went there for concerts. The palace was located in the central part of the city, on the Ring, which was the border of the Inter-Union district. Here along the small ring of Ringstrasse lined up numerous stores, cafes, cinemas, and therefore you could always see Allied officers and soldiers. At first when we met, we looked at each other with mutual curiosity. But soon enough our comrades got used to the berets of long-haired Englishmen, and to the pilots of the Americans, and to the cylindrical caps of the French. The brigade settled near Wiener Neustadt at Enzisfeld. Here, on the gentle slopes of the foothills of the Austrian Alps, in a picturesque green corner near the Rothschild Castle, spread our camp. There was silence all around. Only the forest rustled thoughtfully. Wild boars, roe deer, hares sometimes came to the camp itself. "The forest is good," the soldiers said among themselves. "And yet such forests as in Russia, nowhere to find." After capturing Austria, the Nazis built an aircraft factory in Enzisfeld in the Alpine foothills. It was less visible and vulnerable from the air. And next to the factory grew a barracks camp, girdled with double barbed wire, through which the high-voltage current was passed. The barracks had remained uninhabited for months, and yet when we entered one of them, our nostrils were hit with such a terrible odour of sweat and blood-soaked wooden shields that we literally flew out of there. Wiener Neustadt was located 50 kilometres from Vienna and was a major centre of Hitler's military industry. Allied aircraft subjected the city to devastating bombing raids. Most of it was demolished by explosions. In the streets, piled with piles of bricks, were cleared only narrow passages for pedestrians, and above the city ruins, like a monument, rose the miraculously survived twin towers of the medieval cathedral. This is Hitlerplatz. That's how the square used to be called, explained to us in broken Russian a not young woman standing in line at the bus stop. And these ruins are in Hitler's homeland. Symbolic. Isn't it? Isn't it? It was the last days of the Austrian fall of 1945. The forests of the Viennese suburbs had not yet shed their leaves. The dim sun was still gilding the earth, and on the tops of the mountains and in the foothills the snow caps were clearly whitened. Winter was approaching with a soft step. Our native 207th Separate Motorized Engineering Sestakowski, Order of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and Red Star Battalion finished its combat journey. The battalion, the child of the war, was born in the heavy fall of the 42nd near the Don. 3 years have passed since then. It is so little and so much. In battles and fights along the way. We had to go through a lot. Cherkashin hummed to his guitar when it was time to part with his comrades in arms in the camp near the Alps. Yes, indeed, the battalion has travelled a lot. More than 10,000 kilometres have remained at us behind shoulders. Our miners participated in 12 battles and dozens of fights. On the combat account of the 207th OMIB, there were 67 blown-up German tanks and 56 automobiles, 1 downed airplane, 1,500 destroyed Hitlerites. Only in battles 400 prisoners were taken. Fulfilling the tasks on the device of mine explosive barriers, the personnel of the battalion installed 68253 anti-tank and anti-personnel mines, almost 600 landmines and time mines, mined 111 large and medium bridges, blew up 37 large bridges in the process of fighting. Clearing the way to victory for the Soviet troops, the specialists of the battalion cleared almost 20,000 mines of different systems and 63 large bridges prepared by the enemy for explosion. How can you list all of them? More than 600 kilometres of roads, for example, were checked for mines. Besides, sappers of the battalion built several hundred bridges with the length of 4,800 linear metres. And now there was peace on earth. One of the first peace acts of the Soviet government was to reduce the number of troops stationed in Europe. Many were therefore discharged to the reserve. It was a pity to part with the marvellous combat team, bonded by the dangers experienced together. And at the same time it was so joyful to return home as winners, to our relatives and friends, to return to the motherland to help it heal the wounds inflicted by the war.